Namaste and welcome you all. Since our last several lectures, we have been discussing about various formulas of marginal costing technique. In our last lecture, we have discussed various formulas to calculate sales, profit and loss. Now today we are going to understand formulas available to calculate contribution and fixed cost. Total 6 formulas to calculate total contribution and total 5 formulas to calculate per unit contribution we are going to discuss now. Means total 6 formulas to calculate total contribution, 5 formulas to calculate per unit contribution. In that way 6 plus 5 is equal to total 11 formulas we are going to discuss to calculate contribution. Then we are going to discuss total 7 formulas to calculate fixed cost. So let's start with total contribution. So first formula to calculate total contribution is equal to sales less variable cost. As we know, sales includes 3 contents, which are these: variable cost, fixed cost and profit. So when we deduct variable cost, then fixed cost and profit will remain, and these two collectively known as contribution. In that way we get the amount of contribution. Second formula, fixed cost plus profit. As we know, fixed cost and profit collectively known as contribution. That's why when we take sum of these two items, then we get the amount of total contribution. Next, third, fixed cost less loss. Why? As we know, loss is a difference between contribution and fixed cost when fixed cost is greater than contribution. That's why when we deduct loss from fixed cost, then we get the amount of total contribution. Next, sales less PV ratio. PV ratio means contribution to sales ratio. That's why if we multiply sales by contribution to sales ratio or PV ratio, then we get the amount of total contribution. Next, if we know the per unit contribution and if we multiply per unit contribution by total number of units, then we will get the amount of total contribution. Per unit contribution into total units is equal to total contribution. In that way. Next and last, 6 formula to calculate total contribution. Sales less variable cost ratio. Suppose sales is rupees 100 less variable cost ratio, suppose which is 80%. So 100 less 80%. So 80% of 100 is 80. So 100 less 80 is equal to 20 will be the amount of total contribution. In that way we can calculate total contribution. So we have discussed total 6 formulas to calculate total contribution. Now we are going to discuss formulas available to calculate per unit contribution. So per unit contribution, first formula, per unit selling price less per unit variable cost. As we know, sales less variable cost is equal to contribution. In that way, per unit selling price less per unit variable cost is equal to per unit contribution. Second formula, per unit selling price less variable cost ratio. Suppose your selling price is rupees 10 and your variable cost ratio is 80%. So 10 less 80% of 10. 80% of 10 is 8. So 10 less 8 is equal to 2 will be the amount of per unit contribution. Next, third formula. If you know the amount of total contribution divided by total number of units is equal to per unit contribution. In same way, fourth formula works. Total fixed cost divided by BIP units. Why? Because as we know, the amount of total fixed cost and amount of contribution at BP level, not total contribution. Amount of fixed cost and contribution at BP level is always equal. Amount of fixed cost and amount of contribution at BP level is always equal. Why? As we discuss. Why it happens? Because it is the amount of contribution which is utilized to recover total fixed cost. That's why when our contribution amount becomes exactly equal to total fixed cost, then in that way our total fixed cost get recovered. Means our total contribution amount get utilized to recover our total fixed cost. In that way total contribution become exactly equal to total fixed cost, and automatically our total sales and total cost become exactly equal, and ultimately then at that point of time BEP stage comes, or no profit no loss stage comes. That's why the amount of fixed cost and the amount of contribution at BEP level is always equal. That's why we have taken total fixed cost amount as a amount of contribution at BEP level. So contribution at BEP level divided by BEP units is equal to per unit contribution. Just like third formula, total contribution less total units is equal to per unit contribution. In that way contribution at BEP level divided by BEP units is equal to per unit contribution. In same way fifth formula works. As we know, the amount of profit and the amount of contribution at margin of safety sales level is always equal. The amount of profit and the amount of contribution at margin of safety sales level is always equal. That's why we have taken amount of profit as a amount of contribution at margin of safety sales level. So contribution at margin of safety level divided by margin of safety units is equal to per unit contribution. In that way we calculate per unit contribution. So we have discussed 6 formulas to calculate total contribution and 5 formulas to calculate per unit contribution. Now we are going to discuss 7 formulas to calculate fixed cost. Let's start with first formula. As we know, total cost means sum of two costs, variable cost and fixed cost. So if you deduct variable cost from if you deduct variable cost from total cost, then remaining will be the fixed cost. That's a total cost less variable cost is equal to fixed cost. Then second formula. As we know, sales includes 3 contents, which are these: variable cost, profit and fixed cost. If you deduct variable cost and profit, what will remain? Fixed cost. In that way this formula works. Third, contribution less profit. As we know, contribution is sum of fixed cost and profit, or in other words we can say fixed cost and profit collectively known as contribution. So if we deduct profit from contribution, then fixed cost will remain. So contribution less profit is equal to fixed cost. Next, contribution plus loss is equal to fixed cost. Why? As we know, loss is difference between contribution and fixed cost when fixed cost is greater than contribution. That's why if we add the amount of loss in the amount of contribution, then we get the amount of total fixed cost. Then fifth formula, BEP sales into PV ratio is equal to fixed cost. How? As we know, sales into PV ratio, that is contribution to sales ratio. Sales to PV ratio is equal to contribution. Sales into PV ratio is equal to contribution. But here sales is BEP sales. So BEP sales into PV ratio is equal to contribution at BEP level. BEP sales into PV ratio is equal to contribution at BEP level. And as we know, the contribution at BEP level amount and amount of total fixed cost is same. So if you calculate contribution at BEP level, means you have calculated fixed cost also, because these two figures are always equal. In that way fixed cost amount get calculated automatically. Why? Because contribution at BEP sales level and fixed cost amount is always equal. That's why if you calculate contribution at BEP level, means you have calculated fixed cost also, because these two figures are always equal. Means this contribution at BEP sales level is rupees 50, then fixed cost will always be 50, means equal to the contribution at BEP level. So BEP sales into PV ratio is equal to contribution at BEP level. The amount of contribution at BEP level and amount of fixed cost is always equal. That's why the same amount will be the amount of total fixed cost. The amount of contribution at BEP level and the amount of fixed cost is always equal. Next, sixth formula. If we know the per unit contribution into BEP units is equal to contribution at BEP level, means fixed cost. How? Because contribution at BEP level is always equal to fixed cost, as we discuss, as we know. So if you calculate contribution at BEP level, means you have calculated fixed cost also. Next, last. While discussing contents of BEP sales and contents of margin of safety sales, we had discussed that BEP sales has two contents. BEP sales has two contents. First, variable cost of BEP units, and second, fixed cost. So if you deduct variable cost of BEP units from BEP sales, what will remain? Fixed cost will remain. In that way, we calculate the amount of fixed cost. BEP sales less first content variable cost of BEP units. BEP sales less variable cost of BEP units is equal to fixed cost. In that way, we calculate the amount of fixed cost. Now question arises, how to calculate variable cost of BEP units? It's simple. Per unit variable cost into BEP units is equal to variable cost of BEP units. And the same we have to deduct from BEP sales, then amount of fixed cost will remain. In that way, fixed cost will get calculated. So now in this lecture we have discussed total 6 formulas to calculate total contribution, 5 formulas to calculate per unit contribution, 6 plus 5 total 11 formulas to calculate contribution we discussed, and we have also discussed total 7 formulas to calculate total fixed cost. So I hope all of you understood it. Thank you.